First of all, I'll talk a little bit just quickly about myself and give you a bit more of an introduction, not about any of my books or all the awards I've lost, but just about where I'm from and a bit of my family background. I think it's relevant to talk about, traditional stories. I think one of the things we're really talking about is, oral stories or oral storytelling. And, certainly, I do a lot of that. So as a writer, I'm traveling all the time and giving a lot of talks. And sometimes what I don't think about is that when I give talks, even when I give talks like this or in person, that's oral storytelling, and it's one of the traditional ways that we tell stories. And so I thought I would give a bit of background through oral storytelling, and just let you know a bit about my upbringing and how I grew up detached from culture, and then how I came to the culture for the first time as a young man, and then get into some of the stuff about traditional storytelling, and then of course and then the adaptation of them into some of the books that I've done, and they exist in a lot of the literature that I put out there into the world in different ways. And what I'll do near the end is probably just zero in on a series called the Misewa Saga, and how that series was adapted from traditional stories of the sky and the constellations. So that's what it'll look like. And then I'll keep this Q&A open. So I'll definitely leave time at the end for questions. But if I see anything, I can answer as I go along. And if anything's burning on your mind that you want to ask as I'm speaking, just throw it in there, and then we can I can kind of address that when I feel like it. So so my name's Dave, and I'm from Canada. I can hear in the background that my son is listening to the World Juniors hockey tournament, and I think you guys are beating us pretty badly right now. So congratulations on that one. I live in Winnipeg, which is just pretty much the center of Canada. As much as Toronto might want to tell you that they are the center of Canada, we're like the actual physical center of Canada, pretty much. So I lived in Winnipeg most of my life. Winnipeg, if you don't know, is in the summer it gets pretty hot and it's pretty nice here. In the winter, it is very cold and very white and very snowy. And it's a dry cold. So and it's windy, which is, can be windy, which is not the best when it's cold out. Right now, it's been a mild day, but in January, it can get down to minus 35 centigrade, maybe on bad days. So that's when the centigrade and Fahrenheit meet, it's bad. So and it does that in the minus 30 to 40 or something. I often tell people, if you want to know what the Barren Grounds, which is the first book of the Misewa Saga, looks like, just come to Winnipeg in the winter, and then you will know. So, but I grew up here, and I do love the city as much as I kind of make fun of it from time to time. I've lived here since I was about 2 or 3 years old. I'm part Cree, so that's my Indigenous background is Cree, and that's on my dad's side. So my dad was born and raised in a community called Norway House Cree Nation. He grew up on the trap line, on the land, and it's a way of life that I've really come to appreciate and really in love as I've gotten older. But when I was a kid, it wasn't really something I knew anything about. My parents, when I was younger, and Lucinda was just talking about Kíwew. Kíwew is a podcast where I detail my background, and a memoir as well called Blackwater. And one of the things, if you've listened to the podcast or read Blackwater, which is my memoir, you'll know that my parents were separated when I was younger. So I grew up with my mom. My mom is non-Indigenous. And so she raised my brothers and I have two brothers, and did a great job. My brothers and I grew up pretty well. And, we're how my grandfather on my mom's side would say gentlemen. But at the same time, she wasn't really equipped to teach us, what it meant to be Indigenous. She wasn't really equipped to raise me as, Cree. And so I missed a lot of that as I was growing up. And so I grew up, what I would say, even though I was, am and was Indigenous Cree, I'm distracted by chat here, but even though I was raised, even though I've always been Indigenous, obviously I was raised non-Indigenous, I would say. And so I really related more to my, to my non-Indigenous side as I was growing up. And a whole other conversation is, about how I felt really ashamed about my Indigenous background because of the stuff that I was learning that was really inaccurate but harmful about Indigenous people. But I grew up without those stories, is the main point. So I grew up without all the traditional stories that I've learned later in life. I didn't have those as a kid. And one of the things I'm often asked is, what traditional stories were you told when you were younger? What traditional stories did you learn when you were a kid? And I often have to say that I didn't learn any, I didn't know any. So there are things that I've learned later in life. And I would also say that my father, even though he was a recognized elder, and he was involved in Indigenous education and grew up traditionally on the trap line, he was also a minister and grew up in a different way. And so he never really told me traditional stories himself, as you may come to think of them, as like creation stories or on the back of the turtle, stuff like that. I never heard those from my father. I've learned them from other elders and other storytellers. So that's kind of how I grew up. And so I grew up without those stories. And I should say, just quickly, I have 5 kids of my own. And so I try to introduce them to things that, maybe I would miss when I was younger. And I think that, as a parent, we oftentimes raise our kids similarly to how we were raised, but we also not necessarily improve on things, but we look at things we may have done differently, and we kind of raise our kids in sometimes with the same values, same traditions, but we also look at things that maybe we feel like our parents didn't do and that we would like to do. And so definitely, my kids have grown up far more engaged with their Indigenous culture, Indigenous backgrounds than I did. So that's about, a bit about my childhood. I was introduced to Cree culture later in life. So I would say past high school. And the catalyst for that was really my parents reconciling. So my mother and my father got back together, and all of a sudden my dad came back into my life. And my dad was really a conduit to my Cree identity, my Indigenous identity. And so that even though he didn't teach me a lot about traditional stories, for example, he was an entryway, a doorway into my Cree background. And so it's really only as I've started writing, as an author, writing books, and doing all the research that's required in writing stories, and especially because I've had a focus. All my books I've written about 29, 30 books. All of them have been about Indigenous people. Only as I've started writing these books and researching them have I begun to understand what traditional stories are, what they mean, what their value is, and begin to actively learn more and more of them, and also have developed different ideas about what they are. And I think that's also important, because they're not just legends, as I define traditional stories. So I'm also going to look at the different types of traditional stories as I go through this talk. So since I've begun to become attached to my traditional to my Indigenous identity, as I've begun to write books and learn, and I've begun to adapt these stories into my literature in various ways. And it's also taught me, as I said, the different types of traditional stories. And I've also found that sometimes those types have blurred lines between them. So, what distinguishes them from each other becomes a little hazy. So, one story and another story, and you look at them and you think one of them might be based more on history, one of them might be based more on legend, but in some cases, the lines between the two are blurred. And so what I think is important when we talk about the adaptation of traditional stories into literature is that oftentimes we can look at them and we hear these terms like magical realism, for example, or mythology, and I think it's important to keep in mind that sometimes when we look at traditional stories and their adaptation into literature, that these stories can, from the Indigenous perspective, be taken as literal stories. So they're not always mythology. They're not always legends. They're not always magical realism. And so I think that it's important to keep that in mind, and to kind of to respect that within different Indigenous cultures, a lot of these stories are rooted in fact. And sometimes what you'll see, and I'll talk about this in one of the books that I'll kind of go over, is that these stories have evolved from history and they have become legend. So, and that's kind of interesting as well. So an example might be stories that center around Mistipeo in Cree, which is a Bigfoot in English. So, and in Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, it's Sabe, which is what Bigfoot is in English. In Ojibwe, it's Sabe. So in a lot of Indigenous cultures, Bigfoot is actually, a real being. So that it's not a legendary figure. He or she is a real being. Another example would be of the Little People. So the Little People, if any of you have not heard of the Little People, they're the Cree people and other Indigenous people. And again, I think for me, it's important also to recognize that different Indigenous cultures have different values, different beliefs, different stories. So when I speak, I'm not speaking for all Indigenous cultures. So that's important. So when I speak about the Little People, some Indigenous cultures may not have Little People within their stories. I don't know. I don't know all of the Indigenous cultures and all of their stories. So when I'm speaking, I'm speaking from the Cree perspective. I just wanted to kind of also keep that in mind. But so the Cree people, we believe that there are kind of two forms of humanoid beings on the earth. And so one of them would be people, like human beings, like me and like you. And so that would be one form of humanoid beings, would be people. The other would be little people. And little people are, the ways in which they look are different depending on the culture. How I picture them, how the stories that I've learned, they would be noseless. So there would be really a nose. obviously smaller, and a little creepy looking actually. But I've written a story about them that's coming out in the spring, a children's book, a picture book, called The Song That Called Them Home, and it's based on the little people. In Cree, they're called the Memagwijiwak, which is the little people. And again, that sounds like mythology. That sounds like legend. But I will say that if you talk to a lot of Indigenous people who have little people in their stories, that a lot of Indigenous people believe them to be actual beings, so, and my dad, who is, I would say that my dad, if you knew my dad, so if you want to know my dad, read my memoir, listen to the podcast, Kíwew. But my dad, when he lived on the trap line, he told me a story once about him seeing little people. So I could look at my dad and I could say, Dad, you're such a liar, because that can't be true, right? But we also have to, I think, sometimes realize that there are things in this world and beyond this world that we just haven't seen yet, and we don't understand, and we don't know, right? So, and so just because something exists that we haven't seen doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? And so my dad, when he says he saw little people, who am I to say that he didn't see them? I mean, he's a rational man. He was, and so I'm assuming he was also a rational child. But he saw these little people in a vessel, like on the water, and they lived. Oftentimes in stories, they lived behind waterfalls, and so this canoe was going along the water and disappeared behind a waterfall, and then it was gone, right? So it's kind of, and he told me a story like that. So that was kind of interesting. And so a lot of stories, they do live behind waterfalls, and they're also very mischievous. So they will actually, for people going in a canoe around where little people are, they will capsize those canoes, and they'll oftentimes be a lot more vicious with adults, and they'll be, kinder to children, right? So, and so the story that I wrote in the spring is an adaptation of traditional stories about little people, and it involves children who are in a canoe that is capsized. And so it's kind of like this blend of traditional storytelling and classic literature. So, and I consider, like, a story like Outside Over There by Maurice Sendak, classic literature. And so what I like to do oftentimes, and I'll tell you how this is okay, is blend traditional storytelling with classic literature, and kind of give a whole new perspective on classic stories and traditional stories. And so I really like doing stuff like that. And so that's The Song That Called Them Home, is a story that does that. So anyway, so the line between legend, magical realism, and the stories that exist within traditional storytelling is often blurred. And so, but that's okay. I mean, I think that's actually pretty exciting. But traditional stories, here's different versions with the different types of traditional stories, keeping that in mind. So one of them would be traditional stories that document. So, and typically this would be through the oral tradition. So traditional stories serve as a documentation of, what do they document? So they would document history. They would document ways of living. What I would say is that because we've been doing this as Indigenous peoples across different cultures, and I can say with pretty fair amount of certainty that most Indigenous cultures, if not all of them, have a history of oral storytelling, and that history of oral storytelling, those oral stories, and in so much as they are a documentation of history and ways of living. And again, that's a form of traditional stories. There is as much value in that history as there are in written records. So, I think that one of the things I look at is that when I look at the written record of history, and this is true of oral storytelling as well, I would say, is that, oftentimes a written record can be as much fictional as you might look at any other story, because it's told from a certain perspective. And I would, there's a couple of books that I think you should read. One of them is called The Power of Story by Harold Johnson, and it just came out this year. He passed away. It came out last year. He passed away last year. And one of the things he says is that all stories are a lie because they're told through one perspective, and that perspective is also skewed by personal experience, memory, all of those things. And so I think that that's also maybe just an interesting point. But anyway, so the traditional storytelling, oral storytelling, to me has as much value as the written record, because there's, inherent bias in both, but there's also accuracy and value in both as well. So that's one form. In traditional stories, in that documentation, they also teach values, beliefs, and morals. And so that is another form of traditional storytelling. And I'll tell you a quick little story that kind of gives you an idea of what that looks like. And so my dad, and this is a story he told me when I was a man, when we were just a few years ago. And we went to the trap line together. And my dad and I were walking along the trap line, and he was telling me all these stories about his youth. And I would say that would be also a form of storytelling, traditional storytelling, because he was telling me oral stories that he was told. And that's how it works, right? So like in the oral tradition, what we do is we tell stories to one generation, and that generation tells stories to the next generation. Then that generation tells stories to the next generation. So those stories are passed down or preserved. And so I think that, that's kind of now we do it in different ways, but the goal to me is still preservation, documentation, so to make sure that these stories never die. And I think I would add that these stories, beyond just documentation and preservation, it's also, to me, when I write books, sharing these stories beyond just the Indigenous population, so that the non-Indigenous population has as much value out of them as we do, because I think there's great moral value in a lot of the stories that we have. So anyway, so my dad, one day, he just was, as we were walking along the trap line together, we stopped by this boulder, and this boulder had this flat surface. And he told me the story about how when he was a boy, obviously that boulder was still there, and his grandfather and him were fishing. They had to eat lunch. And one of the things my dad used to say is that when we were hungry, we had to catch something. If we didn't catch something, we went hungry, because there weren't fridges, there wasn't a grocery store on the trap line. It was all supply and demand, and it was only take what you need, right? And so my dad, they were hungry, they went fishing, and so they went fishing, they caught some fish, and my dad was waiting by this boulder. He was about 9 years old or so at the time. And his grandfather, my great grandfather, was cooking the fish. My dad was waiting, and then his grandfather finished cooking the fish. And when he's finished cooking the fish, he brought it over and he put the fish right down on the stone, right down on the boulder. And my dad looked at it and he said, "Grandpa, why did you put the fish down on the boulder? Where is my plate?" And his grandfather said, "Grandson, that is your plate right there." And he pointed to the boulder. My dad was like, "Grandpa, that is not a plate, that is a boulder." And his grandfather went on to tell him the story about how Creator has shaped that rock over a course of thousands of years to make it what it is today, so that he can use it in different ways. And one of those ways was as a plate, as a table through which he can eat on. And so, it was a quick little story. And what it said to him was, through that story that my dad told, that he was told, that the land provides gifts.
And one of those gifts is, in this case, just providing someone something to eat off, right? And use it as a plate, right? And that's an example of how these stories exist and the purpose of them. My dad used to tell me stories about his first day of school. And he told me, there's a long story he told me about how on the first day of school, his teacher and how she taught and the way she taught and her focus in teaching, how it affected him. And so that's a story I've told lots of times. And that is a traditional form of storytelling. And it has a moral to it. It has a point or a meaning to it, right? So that's something I always think about. Whatever story I tell, I think more than anything, I think about what is the meaning here? Like, what is the value? What is it trying to teach? And that is very much a traditional sensibility, right? So the Misewa Saga, which is like a fantasy series, a portal story, it is also a series that has intrinsic value in what it is trying to teach you, the values that it's trying to instill or share, right? And that I think has a very much a traditional sensibility to it. And in traditional stories as well, they explain how things are. They explain how things came to be and the world that we are living in. So that can come in the form of, creation stories. So, a lot of people there have heard stories from Indigenous peoples, different Indigenous cultures about how the world came to be through, on the back of a turtle, right? So, like Canada, for example, North America is the back of a turtle, right? And so, and there's also stories about how people came to be. So, in different stories, in Cree people, it'd be a being called Wasikajak, which is like almost like a demigod or like a god, but not the god. And even though monotheism is something that we have in Indigenous cultures, we also have different little gods. And I would call a trickster like a godlike kind of being, not the god. Anyway, so what the Wasikajak did was he took mud, and he shaped it into a humanoid form. He let that dry through with fire and shaped it and locked in that shape. And then he breathed life into the being and made people, right? And that's a very bad way of telling the story. It's actually a really good story, but that's a story about how people came to be. And so typically creation stories, they include trickster spirits. So, and in different Indigenous cultures, there's different trickster spirits. So, for the Coast Salish people, for example, it would be coyote. Which is, most people that write about trickster spirits, they'll write about coyote. And for Cree people, it would be Wasikajak. For different cultures, it would be raven. For different cultures, it would be different tricksters. So, but for creation stories, how things came to be, how things were created, you typically involves trickster spirits. There's also stories there that talk about how things came to be. And so there is a story of the Great Bear, which is a constellation story, which I adapted into the second book of the Misewa Saga series. And that's a story that has a large thematic message of bullying. So it's about, and it's an old story, like, it's very old, but it's contemporarily, it's actually very relevant. It talks about bullying, but it also, through its story, explains how the robin got its red breast. And so it again, through this story, it talks about how something came to be. And that in this case is how the robin got its red breast. It's actually blood from the bear that was bullying these different villages. So the robin and other birds chased after this bully bear and killed the bear, mortally wounded the bear, and blood from the bear spurted out, and some of that blood spurted onto the robin's breast and made the robin's breast red. So just explaining how the world came to be and how people came to be, or how things came to be, and that's another form of traditional story. And so, and as I said before,
in a lot of the, my gosh, time goes by very quickly, doesn't it? In a lot of the different ways in which, in my books, I've adapted traditional stories in various ways. And so one of the first adaptations of, and what I'll do is I'll kind of go over a couple of examples, and then I'll talk about practically why, when it's okay to adapt a traditional story, and then how I went about doing it. So what I would say, though, is that as a non-Indigenous writer, I probably wouldn't go there. I probably wouldn't adapt an Indigenous story into literature. That's not really the place. I also would say that in my life as an Indigenous writer, there are stories that I should also not adapt and write about. And these kind of sacred stories are oftentimes, I don't have permission to adapt them, or they're just stories that should not be adapted in this manner, because and maybe because I shouldn't be telling them, because I'm not, for example, a pipe carrier or an elder. And so that I have to keep those things in mind as well. And what I would say is that, when I adapt stories into literature, I always get permission to do it. So, like the Misewa Saga series, it adapts traditional stories of the constellations. And in order to do that, I went to one of my elders. Her name's Betty Ross, and she had a little ceremony, and that involved, laying tobacco, offering tobacco, and then, and she gave me permission in ceremony to adapt these stories into literature. So that was something that I kind of have to go about doing when I do this work as well. Anyway, so one of the first adaptations I did was actually in one of the first graphic novels one of the first books as well I ever wrote, was a series called 7 Generations, which became an omnibus larger book, which is an omnibus is just like a collection of the 4 stories that are meant to be one in one. Not an anthology, but an omnibus. And so in the second part of the 4 parts in 7 Generations, it's actually an adaptation of 3 traditional stories in one. And so what I thought I would do quickly is just show you what that looks like. And so one of them, and there's actually different forms of traditional stories in this adaptation. And so this is the 7 Generations series here. And so I'm going to see if I can make this into a single page view. There you go. Okay. So I'm going to go down to Scars. So the second book in the series is called Scars. There it is right there. And so this is about the smallpox epidemic. And so one of the historical traditional stories that this book adapts is of this young boy whose entire tribe is wiped out by smallpox. And so he goes off onto his own into the wilderness and has to find another tribe to live with so that he can survive. And so that obviously there's more to that story, but I learned that story, and it's an oral story that was passed down since the last great smallpox epidemic in North America, which I believe is like in the 19th century, late 19th century. Although I have to kind of reintroduce myself to that story again. Did I have the date here? Anyway, 1870. So it was in the late 19th century. So what I've done is I've adapted that into this story. And so you see here, it begins with this entire tribe being wiped out, and then as they go along, part of that story is that initially members of the family go with him, but they also get sick, and so eventually this boy is left all on his own, and and he has to survive on his own and find a new tribe. So that is a story that I adapted into Scars. So you can see that adapted here. And then another story is actually also a true story that I would take as true. And it's of this this other person who is going to a tribe or an encampment, and he finds one lone survivor. And again, it's during the time of the smallpox epidemic. And this one lone survivor as this kind of group of people, it's a group of people that are going through this encampment, and they find one lone survivor. It's a woman, and she begs them to take her with them because her family, her entire people have died. And so they refuse to take her with them because they don't also want to get sick. So they leave her behind. And as they leave, they hear her sing this song of sadness, and it sticks into this one person's head, and he can't let it go. And so he goes back one night to that night to try and save her. And when he goes and he finds her, that she's hanged herself. And that's another traditional story, and that should be a trigger warning, I guess, as well. But a story that has been passed down that I also adapted into this graphic novel. And then another story is actually one that is more of I would say more of a mythology-based, legendary-based story, not history-based story, but still a traditional story. And it's of the snake that forms within this storm. And so I kind of also adapted that into this book. And you see here, there's a thunderbird that forms right here in this panel. So that's another traditional story. So this actually is one instance where I wanted to honor the history of traditional storytelling. And so I adapted those three stories into one called Scars. And so that's an example. That's the first time I did it, was in Scars. And so that's just an example for you. And so what I'm going to do actually is I don't really have, I was just going to give you a bunch of examples. Now, what I usually do, and what I have done again in this case, is I have babbled, which my wife always tells me I do, which I know I do. And what I want to do is I'm going to just go over how I adapted the different traditional stories about constellations within the Cree culture into the Misewa Saga series. And so as I've gone along in my career and I've adapted different stories into different forms of literature, one of the things I've done in the last 6-7 years is I have been researching and learning of constellation stories and traditional stories around constellations. And so in the Indigenous cultures, we have different sky stories. In the Cree culture, we have our own sky stories. And what I've loved about them is that and this is what I think I love about traditional stories themselves as well, and what gives me the freedom to be able to do it, is that within those traditional stories, you have freedom because the storyteller can bring their own flair, their own voice to those stories. So depending on who's telling you the story, the different details of the story can change. And I find that gives me the freedom to be able to do the same thing too. The one thing that doesn't change in these traditional stories is the value or meaning of the stories. So that doesn't change from storyteller to storyteller. So what I would want to give you an example of is maybe like a triptych or like 3 different versions of the same story. And that is, of course, the Fisher Star story, which became the book, The Barren Grounds. And The Barren Grounds is kind of like a bonkers book. In itself is not a bonkers book, but in Canada, it's still this week, it was still #1 in Canada for Canadian children's literature. And that's about 2.5 years past its publication date, which is, we don't know, I don't know what's going on with it, but I love it. But it's kind of, what I love it is because the other thing, and I don't know if I mentioned this, but like beyond just like the preservation of these stories, it actually shares them with the mainstream audience. So what I love about it is that, I think the Barren Ground has probably sold almost close to 100,000 copies, or 60, 70,000 copies or so. And that's like thousands and thousands of people who have learned traditional stories through the Barren Grounds and have benefited from the teachings within those traditional stories in learning of them in this form. And I love that about the Barren Grounds, and I love that about the Misewa Saga. In the Misewa Saga, all three books so far have been adaptations of traditional Cree star stories. So the first one is the Fisher Star story, which is called Ochek Ochakosek, which is Ochek is Fisher, Ochakosek is stars, and that is in what you would know as Ursa Major, or the Big Dipper. And so what I just want to give you an example of before I start taking questions, if there are any questions, is, and I see that Ben has a question. Oh yeah, no, I'll answer that for you, Ben, when I get to the questions. So is the different kind of versions of the Fisher Star story. And I want to kind of just give you, I'll read a paragraph or of each one maybe, and you can kind of look at some similarities between the two of them and differences between the two of them. And then what I was able to do is almost make this my own, like take all these different versions of the Fisher Star constellation story and then make my own version of it out of all these different versions, keeping in mind that I have the freedom to do that as long as I stay true to the heart of the story. So what you'll notice in these stories is that details change, but the very important details stay the same. So the hero is always Fisher, which is Ochek. It's always an eternal winter, and he always finds a way to bring warmth back to the North Country to save his village from this never-ending winter. So like those details always remain the same. And because those details remain the same, the message of the story remains the same, which for me, and this is the other thing I think is great about traditional storytelling, the meaning of it, what I tell you the meaning of it is, it matters, I guess, but what you get from it is what's really important, right? So like I can tell you what the Fisher Star story constellation means to me, but when you read it, you might get something different from it. And that's the beauty of stories, is that what it means to you is all that matters, right? And so, and of course, you bring your own life experiences to story. And so that enables you to learn from story in a different way than I would. And I actually really love that, no matter what your background is. So anyway, so these are quick little differences between the two of them. And so I'll tell you, I'll read you a couple paragraphs from one of them, and I'll read you a couple paragraphs from another one. And then I'll kind of talk about quickly about adapting them into the Barren Grounds, and then I'll take some questions. And of course I could have done this for 3 hours, and I always lose track of time. Okay, so the Fisher was living somewhere in this world. Nobody knows where. Now, in those times, they had no summer. It was winter all the time. They knew that summer existed somewhere, but it never came to them, although they wanted it very much. Once upon a time, a man captured some little birds, which are called summer birds. He tied them in bundles and kept them with him all the time. And that was the reason why it was continually winter. For as long as he held these birds, they could not bring summer to the North Country. The animal beings pondered very much how to go about freeing these birds from the man who kept them. At last, somebody discovered where this man lived. In a lot of these stories, the person who discovers where the man lives with the summer birds is the squirrel. And so in the Barren Grounds, its squirrel is Eric Watches, which is squirrel in Cree. And they decided that someone would go and try and free the summer birds. And so the Fisher at last decided to go and free the birds so that summer would come. He traveled a long while and reached eventually the wigwam where the man lived. When he went in, he found, and then it goes on, and the birds are kept in a bundle, and then he chews through the bundle and frees the birds. And there's also the herring, and here is the sandhill crane. who calls out and notifies the man that the birds have been freed, and the man chases after the fisher, shooting arrows at him. And the other details is always the same, is that the tail of the fisher always gets struck by the arrow, and that's why the fisher's tail becomes broken. And so that's one version of it. Another version of it is, in this story, is called How Fisher Went to the Skyland. And again, it's the origin of the Big Dipper. And so this is the first couple paragraphs of that one. And it goes, Fisher was a great hunter. He was not big, but he was known for his determination and regarded as one with great power. Fisher's son wanted to be a great hunter also. One day, the son went out to try and catch something. It was not easy, for the snow was very deep. It was very cold everywhere. In those days, it was always winter, and there was no such thing as warm weather. The son hunted a long time with no luck. Finally, though, he saw a squirrel. As quietly as he could, he sneaked up and then pounced, catching the squirrel between his paws. Before he could kill it, though, the squirrel spoke to him. Grandson, said the squirrel, don't kill me. I can give you some good advice. Speak then, said the young fisher. I see that you are shivering from the cold. If you do what I tell you, we may all enjoy warm weather. Then it will be easy for all of us to find food and not starve as we are doing now. Tell me what to do, grandfather, the young fisher said, letting the squirrel go. And so the squirrel tells the fisher where the summer birds are being kept, and then what he has to do to get his father, the Ochek, the fisher, the great hunter, to go and free them, to bring warmth to this North Country. And so that's like another version of it. And that version is the squirrel. And so it's kind of interesting to see how in these two versions, there's different details, of course, but in both of them, there's a fisher, he's a great hunter. There's a never-ending winter. The animals are starving out, and he has to go on a journey to save his village and bring warmth to the North Country to end the winter. So it's kind of neat. And another version, which I won't tell you, is a version of Isaac Murdoch. And he's a storyteller who has who's Ojibwe. So it's an Ojibwe version of the same one. And I think that what I can do is I can put the link here. So when you have a minute, you can watch the video of Isaac Murdoch's storytelling. And he has a great, I think it's about a 19-minute long story about the Fisher Star constellation story, and it's animated, and he's a great storyteller. He's Canadian, and so when you have a minute, watch that one, and you can see that again, there's different details to it, but there's also similarities to the story that is shared with the other versions of the Fisher Star constellation story. So there you go. So what I did was I took all these different versions and I made a kind of composite version of the Fisher Star story that became my own version of it. And all I did for the Barren Grounds was I took the elements of it. I used my own details. I kept the important details the same. And then I looked at the length of it and decided that I needed to add meat to it to make it into a book length. And so I made human characters. So there is Morgan and Eli, Katie and James, and who are the foster parents. And I also decided that if I'm going to get the kids to find a way into the North Country, which is in another dimension, they need to get there somehow. And so I decided I was going to make it into a portal story. And so again, what I like to do with this one is I took a classic piece of literature, which is Narnia, and I blended it together, which had elements that were kind of similar to the Fisher Star story, in particular, the Never-Ending Winter. And I kind of blended them all together and made them into what became the Barren Grounds. But what you'll find, though, is that even though the story is very different, there are those similarities, and the message of it for me is the same. And so what I wanted this story to teach was what the core value of the traditional story was. And that was that it's about land stewardship, it's about climate change, it's about the environment. And then one of the things I added to it was it's also about systemic racism and foster care and that sort of thing. And so, but the heart of the story, what it's trying to teach, remains the same. And so I wanted to honor that traditional story by doing the same
by teaching the same sort of thing through that traditional story. And and that's what I try to do with all the ways in which I've adapted traditional stories into different forms of literature. Is I've looked at what's the heart of the story, honoring that story, and making sure that it teaches the same sort of values, but also having the freedom, because depending on who's telling the story, they can kind of add their own sort of voice to it. It has given me the freedom to be able to tell the story in different ways, and so hopefully that gives you a bit of background to my own process. And again, I think the important thing for me is understanding what traditional stories are, understanding that they all have, no matter what kind of traditional story they have their own values, beliefs, and message, and to stay true to those messages, to stay true to those values that they're trying to instill or teach. And if you're able to do that and to go about adapting them into the right way, then I think that you've done as much as you can. And I think, again, like in adapting them and sharing them in this way, you're bringing important stories that have the intrinsic value, no matter what they're trying to teach, to a wide audience. And then that way they can benefit everybody. So anyway, that's a bit about traditional stories and adaptation of them. And I'd love to answer questions if anybody has any. I know I babbled on for 55 minutes. We only have a couple minutes left. But I do see there's a question here from Ben, who's aged 11. So Ben says, I read all the Misewa Saga books. They were really good. Thank you, Ben. And how did you come up with Morgan, Eli, and Aski? Well, I think I kind of like mentioned that I created the characters to add human people to the traditional stories. But in particular, like with Morgan and Eli, what I did with Morgan and Eli, Ben, was I created them because I wanted to, like, foster care was something I wanted to teach for a while. And so I created foster kids to bring up an important issue. And so for Morgan and Eli, what I did was Eli, I really wrote him based on a young version of my dad. And so that's where kind of Eli came from. Morgan is based on, I have 3 daughters, but I based Morgan on my 2 older daughters. And the cultural detachment that Morgan experiences is something that I talked about that at the beginning, is something I kind of learned about from my own experiences and tried to write that from a place of truth in writing the character of Morgan. And a ski is just like world building. So I created this entire planet and I mapped everything out. And I made this. A ski is Cree for Earth, and I wanted the story to happen in another dimension. And that's also based on actually traditional stories, because in a lot of stories that we have, Bigfoot actually is a real thing. And the reason why we don't see Bigfoot very much is because he actually can go through portals into other worlds, right? And so that's actually kind of cool. Like there's actually a doctoral candidate who's Indigenous, who is writing about, like, I'm too stupid to understand this, but like quantum physics, and like he's trying to and was writing that doctoral paper based on traditional stories and how they explain interdimensional travel. So it's actually, I'm too dumb to understand that, but they're very smart and they're writing about, and it's based on traditional storytelling. So that's pretty cool stuff. So anyway, so to me, ski, which is where the Misewa is, it's in another dimension. And it's also grounded in, I think, like some of the elements of traditional storytelling and interdimensional travel.
I'd like to, if I may ask a quick question. Graphic novels are huge in our library. What drew you to that specific way of doing storytelling?
Well, actually, that's interesting, because I actually think that graphic storytelling is actually also a traditional form of storytelling. Like when you look at comic books are a form of sequential art. And sequential art is, all that really is images in sequence that when you put them in sequence, they tell a story. And, we have been using sequential art to communicate with each other before we had words. And so if you look at like the most ancient form of communication, it is in wall paintings, and so if you look at wall paintings are just comic books, and so one of the reasons why I started out writing graphic novels was because, first of all, I wanted to honor ancient forms of how we've talked to each other and how we've told stories. A more contemporary reason is because comic books have been brutal in how they've depicted Indigenous people. And so I wanted to write comics that would have value in how they depict Indigenous people. So they have, authentic characters and history and from an Indigenous perspective. So they kind of can maybe undo a bit of damage that comics have done in the last, several decades. And so that's what I've tried. So there's a few reasons why I chose to do graphic novels, but those are kind of the two main reasons.
We got a question on the chat which says, Becky is asking, what did you find most challenging in adapting the traditional stories into your modern stories?
I think it's just like, for me, it's just like, is making sure that I was staying true to the story. I was finding ways to incorporate all the very important elements and then weaving it. I think the hardest thing was weaving it all together with the stuff I was making up. And adding to the existing elements of the traditional stories to make it all kind of balance fluidly and work together in harmony. And so that was probably the hardest thing for me to do. So it's taking the Fisher Star story and then adding Morgan and Eli, adding foster parents, adding portals, and then kind of weaving it all together into one kind of story that made sense. And that I think did the same thing in terms of teaching that the Fisher Star constellation story did. And so I think that's probably the hardest thing about, for me in adapting traditional stories into modern stories. It's the weaving together of all these different elements to stay true to the heart of the stories.
Annette asks, do you write and illustrate? Do you do both sides of it?
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, I would love to be able to illustrate. The only thing I can really illustrate is like Dora the Explorer. I did draw the maps that are in the Misewa Saga, but they made them better. But like, I did draw them. But no, I'm not. I mean, there's an argument to be made that is if any art is really can't be bad art, but I would say if there is bad art, it's my art. But I only write the stories. I actually am very blessed to work with very good illustrators who are very, very talented. And so I've worked with a lot of Indigenous artists. I've worked with a lot of non-Indigenous artists, whether it's picture books, graphic novels, or even just the cover. The cover art for the Misewa Saga is done by a Métis artist in Western Canada. So, but no, I only write. I don't illustrate.
So Carl, let me read some of the things he said. Thank you so much for finding and building on your background to work traditional Cree stories and spirits to today. You are lucky to have that balance and skills. Lee says Fisher's death scene was so beautiful. Thank you for that. And I think you just spoke on, Carl was asking if you could speak on some of the other illustrators that you've worked with, but I don't know if you want to share other names, but
you should definitely check out their work. I'll tell you their names just so you can check them out. So I've worked with Julie Flett, who's an amazing Métis illustrator, a picture book illustrator here in Canada. I've worked with Natasha Donovan, who did all the covers for the Misewa Saga series, and who I've worked with on a couple of comic books. I've worked with Scott Henderson, who's a non-Indigenous artist. I've worked with him on 10 to 15 graphic novels. I've worked with a lot. I've worked with more recently Maya McKibben, who illustrated the song that called them home. There is great people that I've worked with. And I do work closely with the illustrators. So you do have to build a relationship of trust between you and the illustrator. So we work very closely together with a lot of conversations. And you also have to be able to put a lot of faith in the illustrator to tell the story that's true to the way you've written it, but also that is able to. You have to understand, I think, that illustrators also are storytellers. And so you have to have faith that they'll be able to tell a story with in a bit in their own way as well, and give them that trust to be able to do that. So it is an important relationship, and we do work very closely with each other as we develop the graphic novel or comic book or picture book, whatever it might be.
All right.
So
Well, thank you.
thanks for all the questions and comments. I appreciate it.